Matt Sullivan sat in the third-floor conference room at Pemberton Industrial Solutions with his hands flat on the table. Across from him, Kyle Pemberton had already taken the seat at the head badge clipped to his lanyard, the plastic still glossy, printed that morning. On the table in front of Matt lay a manila envelope, 2 weeks of severance, 11 years folded into a single HR packet. The HR director read through the termination clause without looking up. Kyle wasn't looking at Matt either. He was scrolling through his phone, one ankle crossed over his knee. Laura Colburn stood by the window with her arms folded and her jaw set tight. She hadn't said a word since the meeting started. When the HR director finished, Kyle extended his hand across the table. Matt looked at the hand, then he looked at Laura. He picked up the envelope, pushed his chair back, and walked out without shaking anyone's hand. He built the system that kept that entire company running, and they threw him out like he never mattered. This is one of those stories that'll keep you here until the very end. 2 days before that conference room, Matt Sullivan's morning started the way it always did. 5:45, kitchen light on, coffee machine running, the rest of the house still dark. He made 2 lunches, turkey and Swiss for himself, peanut butter and grape jelly for Cody, crusts cut at the diagonal because that was the only way the kid would eat it. Cody was 10. He was already at the kitchen table with a paperback propped against the cereal box, eating Cheerios one at a time, reading without being told to. Neither of them talked much in the mornings. They didn't need to. Matt at the counter, Cody at the table, the clock on the microwave ticking towards 6:15. Matt was 38. He'd been at Pemberton Industrial Solutions for 11 years, hired out of a steel processing plant across the river in Braddock. Came in as a junior process engineer, the kind of hire who showed up 20 minutes early, stayed an hour late, and never asked for a title change. What he asked for, 6 months in, was access to the production floor's control architecture. His supervisor gave it to him mostly to see what would happen. What happened was the grid. Over 3 years, working nights and weekends on top of his regular shifts, Matt designed a proprietary production control system from scratch. The grid managed everything: raw material intake, vendor ordering, batch scheduling, quality inspection, real-time calibration across all 3 production lines. 340 employees depended on it every shift, and most of them had no idea that one man had built the entire thing alone in a windowless office on the 2nd floor, debugging code at 11 at night. His wife had been gone 4 years now. Matt never talked about it at work, and nobody pressed. What people noticed was that he kept showing up, same time every morning, same quiet focus, same door open on the 2nd floor. If anything, he got stiller after she passed, but the work never slipped. Not once. Laura Colburn was 35, appointed CEO 2 years earlier after climbing from regional sales coordinator to VP of sales. First person outside the Pemberton family to hold the position. She'd earned it by turning a flat-lined Midwest territory into the company's top revenue region in back-to-back years. She ran the business with clean numbers and direct questions, and she relied on Matt Sullivan more than anyone else in the building. The restructuring vote came without warning. The board convened on a Tuesday afternoon at the chairman's request. Howard Pemberton, 67, the founder's son, who hadn't set foot in the building in months, but still controlled enough board votes to move anything he wanted. Laura received the result by email at 4:17. 1 paragraph. The operations division was being reorganized, and Kyle Pemberton, the chairman's 30-year-old nephew, would replace Matt Sullivan as operations director, effective immediately. Laura hadn't been consulted. By the time she read the email, the decision was already signed. Kyle had been let go from 2 previous companies. The first was a logistics outfit in Columbus, 14 months before they asked him to leave. The second was a packaging distributor outside of Philadelphia, 8 months. His resume described both positions as contract roles. Nobody on the board had asked for references, nobody on the board needed to. His last name was Pemberton, After the conference room, Matt carried his cardboard box across the parking lot. A desk lamp, a framed photo of Cody at a Little League game, a coffee mug. Cody was sitting in the passenger seat of the pickup with the window cracked. Matt set the box in the truck bed, walked around, and climbed in. He started the engine. Cody looked at him, not asking, just looking. Matt turned east toward home. Neither of them said a word for the entire drive. The first week without Matt Sullivan started quietly. Kyle Pemberton arrived Monday morning in a sport coat and shoes that had never touched a factory floor. He called an all-hands on the production level, stood on an overturned pallet so people in the back could see him, and announced what he called a modernization initiative. He used the phrase, operational agility, 4 times in 12 minutes. Most of the floor crew stared at him without expression. By Wednesday, Kyle had rearranged the shift schedule, reassigned 2 line supervisors to stations they'd never worked, and manually disabled the grid's automated vendor ordering module. He wanted every purchase requisition routed through his desk for personal approval. The grid's ordering system had been calibrated over 7 years to account for supplier lead times, seasonal demand curves, and minimum order thresholds that varied by vendor. Kyle replaced all of that with a spreadsheet and his own judgment. By Friday, the first cracks showed. 2 shipments went out late. One was 48 hours behind schedule, a precision housing order for a machining client in Akron that had been on automatic fulfillment for 3 years without a single delay. The other shipped on time but arrived incomplete, missing a coupling bracket that the grid would have automatically reordered 3 days in advance if its ordering module hadn't been shut off. A batch of milled components came off line 2 at 0.03 millimeters outside tolerance. Not enough to trigger a recall, but enough that the client's quality team flagged it and sent the entire pallet back. The floor crew knew what was happening. Nobody said it out loud, but the conversations in the break room got quieter. People started checking things twice that the grid used to check for them. Laura pulled Matt's personnel file that Saturday. She sat at her desk with the building empty around her and opened the folder she'd never had a reason to open before. 14 internal patents, every one assigned to the company. And beneath the patent filings, a 62-page system architecture document dated March of 2015, the original blueprint for the grid. Every algorithm, every dependency chain, every calibration protocol. The document listed one author, Matt Sullivan. No co-contributors, no advisory team, just a process engineer who'd built the nervous system of a 300-person factory by himself. She drove to his house that afternoon. Lawrenceville, a narrow street lined with older row homes and mature trees, porches with mismatched chairs, a pickup truck in every other driveway. Matt's was the blue one with the toolbox bolted to the bed. He was on the porch replacing a section of railing, pencil behind his ear, sawdust on his forearms and across the front of his shirt. He heard Laura's car pull up and park at the curb. He didn't stop what he was doing, didn't look up until she was already on the steps. She stood at the edge of the porch and asked if he'd consider coming back as a consultant, temporary, hourly, whatever terms worked for him. Matt held a railing spindle in place with one hand and set the level down with the other. He looked at her the way you look at someone delivering news you've already heard. "No," he said. Not angry. Not bitter. Just finished. A man who'd closed a door and wasn't interested in checking whether it was still locked. Laura nodded. She left her business card on the railing post before she walked back to her car. That night it rained a slow, steady drizzle that started around 9 and didn't let up until morning. Matt saw the card from the kitchen window while he was washing the dinner dishes. The ink had started to bleed. He dried his hands on a towel, looked at it for a few seconds, and turned off the kitchen light. The card stayed where it was, but that card wasn't going anywhere. And neither was the truth about what was really happening inside Pemberton Industrial Solutions. The second week was worse. 2 of the company's largest clients filed formal complaints. An aerospace subcontractor out of Erie had received a shipment with incorrect packing documentation. Their receiving department rejected the entire pallet at the loading dock and sent it back. The machining outfit in Akron, the same one that had gotten the late order the week before, was now 6 days past due on a second run. Their purchasing manager called Laura directly and told her that if the next delivery missed its window, they'd be looking at alternatives. Kyle held a meeting with the warehouse crew. He stood at the front of the room with his hands in his pockets and told them the problem was accountability, execution, focus. Then he pointed at a shift supervisor named Dale Wexler, 9 years, with the company, 2 kids, a mortgage in Aspinwall, and fired him on the spot in front of the entire team. No write-up, no HR review, just, "You're done here." That night, Laura ran the production data herself. She pulled every order that had shipped late or incomplete over the past 2 weeks and traced each one backward through the grid's internal log. The pattern was identical every time. Kyle had overridden the automated sequencing. He'd changed vendor lead times without updating the downstream calculations. He'd rerouted material allocations manually and broken dependency chains that Matt had spent years calibrating. Every failure, every late shipment, every rejected batch, every inventory mismatch traced directly to a manual override entered under Kyle Pemberton's login. She confronted him the next morning in his office. Kyle leaned back in the chair, Matt's old chair, behind Matt's old desk, and shrugged. "My uncle approved my approach," he said. "You have a problem with it, talk to the board." Laura held a quiet meeting with the remaining operations team that afternoon. 6 people around a folding table in a back office. Most of them looked at the floor. They were afraid. 2 had mortgages. 1 had a daughter starting college in the fall. Nobody wanted to end up like Dale Wexler. After the meeting, Frank Kettner lingered in the hallway. He was 52, a shift supervisor who'd worked under Matt for the better part of 8 years. He waited until the corridor was empty, then fell into step beside Laura as she walked toward the elevator. Without slowing down, he slid a USB drive into her hand. "Matt's backup logs," he said, barely above the sound of the ventilation system. He kept copies of everything. Laura opened the files on her laptop at home that night, sitting cross-legged on the couch with the lights dimmed and the house quiet. The grid had recorded every single override Kyle had entered since the day he started, time-stamped, sequenced, cross-referenced against the original parameters Matt had built. Each override had broken something. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. In the way a clock breaks when you pull out one gear, the hands still move, but the time isn't right anymore, and the longer it runs, the further off it gets. She called Matt. He didn't pick up. She called again 20 minutes later. He answered on the 4th ring, and she asked him to meet her. Not at the office. Not at his house. Somewhere else. They met at a diner 3 blocks from his neighborhood, a narrow room with vinyl booths, a chalkboard menu behind the counter, and fluorescent light that buzzed just loud enough to notice. Matt was already seated when Laura walked in, a cup of coffee in front of him, nothing else. She sat across from him, opened her laptop, and turned the screen in his direction. Matt leaned forward and scrolled through the logs. He went very still. His jaw tightened. He was looking at the system he'd spent a decade building, the sequencing trees, the dependency logic, the calibration layers he'd refined year after year, and watching it come apart, entry by entry. Each override was a small severance. Kyle had made dozens. He still wouldn't agree to come back. But he walked Laura through every failure point, one at a time. He explained what each override had disrupted, what downstream systems were affected, what would start breaking next if the original parameters weren't restored soon. Laura wrote it all down on a legal pad she'd pulled from her bag, page after page of notes in small, tight handwriting. The waitress came by and refilled Matt's coffee. The mug was white ceramic with faded blue lettering that read, "World's Okayest Dad." Laura glanced at it for half a second, just long enough to read it, then looked back at her notes without comment. When he'd walked her through everything, Matt closed the laptop and slid it across the table. "That's everything I can give you," he said. He reached for the check before she could, left cash on the table for both coffees, stood, and walked out. Laura sat alone in the booth for another 10 minutes, staring at the legal pad, flipping back through everything he'd said. Week 3 began with a letter on Laura's desk. The Anderson Group, Pemberton's single largest contract, $4.2 million annually, had sent a formal written warning. Delivery performance had fallen below contractual thresholds for 2 consecutive periods. The company had 10 business days to demonstrate corrective action, or the contract would be terminated. Laura read the letter twice, then set it face down on her desk and stared at the wall for a full minute before picking up the phone. She requested an emergency board call. The chairman dialed in from wherever he was. Laura didn't ask, and he didn't say. She laid out the numbers. Late shipments, rejected batches, the 2 formal client complaints, the Anderson letter. She kept her voice flat, professional, precise. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. Then the chairman spoke, his tone unhurried and even. "Give Kyle time," he said. "Every transition has friction." The call lasted 11 minutes. 9 of those were Laura talking. The chairman's contribution was 2 sentences and a goodbye. That same afternoon, Laura was reviewing Kyle's recent purchase orders when a vendor name she'd never seen before appeared across 6 separate invoices. Lakemont Distribution, total value, just over $400,000 in 3 weeks. The vendor wasn't in the company's approved supplier database. There was no onboarding paperwork, no quality audit, no competitive bid, just 6 signed purchase orders, all bearing Kyle's initials. Laura pulled Lakemont's business registration from the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's database. The company had been incorporated 8 months earlier. Its registered agent listed a P.O. box in Cranberry Township, 20 miles north of Pittsburgh. No public phone number, no website, no listed employees. That evening, Laura drove to Matt's house for the 3rd time. Cody had already gone to sleep. The upstairs light was off. Matt opened the door without speaking and stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table with invoices, printouts, and Laura's legal pad spread between them under the overhead light. She showed him the Lakemont paperwork, the invoices, the registration, the pricing. Matt studied the numbers quietly, turning pages one at a time, running his finger down columns the way someone reads a language they know better than anyone else in the room. Laura watched him work. She could see the moment he found it, his finger stopped, his hand went flat on the page, and he was still for several seconds before he looked up. He leaned back in his chair and told Laura about a proposal the chairman had brought to him in 2022. A cost optimization plan that would reroute a portion of the company's raw material purchases through a new regional distributor. The pitch claimed a 15% savings. Matt had reviewed the numbers in detail. The per-unit pricing was structured to look low on the surface, but included surcharges, handling minimums, and volume penalties that would have cost the company more over 12 months than the existing supplier arrangement. The distributor's name on that 2022 proposal was Lakemont Distribution. Matt had written a 4-page internal memo flagging every discrepancy and recommending the company decline. The chairman's response came by email the following week. Declined. Not cost-effective. Matt looked at Laura across the kitchen table. "I said no to this exact deal in 2022, he said. "That's why he wanted me gone." Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The refrigerator compressor kicked on and hummed in the silence. Laura's pen lay on the legal pad where she'd set it down, uncapped. Neither of them reached for it. What Matt Sullivan said at that kitchen table changed everything. Because if he was right, and the numbers said he was, then his termination had nothing to do with restructuring. It had nothing to do with fresh leadership or operational agility, or any of the language the board had used. It was about removing the one man who had already said no. Laura spent the next 3 days in her office with the door closed, pulling records she'd never had a reason to look at before. She traced Lakemont Distribution's incorporation documents through the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's database. The company had one registered agent, an attorney in Cranberry Township, whose practice consisted almost entirely of filing shell company paperwork. She followed that agent's filings to a holding company called Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, incorporated 6 months before Lakemont, same P.O. box, same registered agent, and the sole officer listed on Ridgeline's annual filing was a name Laura recognized the moment she read it, the chairman's wife. She sat at her desk for a full minute after reading that name. Then she pulled the Lakemont invoices again and cross-referenced them against Pemberton's standard material costs. Every line item was inflated not by a round number, not by something obvious, but by layered surcharges and handling fees that pushed the effective cost 35 to 40% above market rate. It was designed to look normal on a casual scan. It was not designed to survive the kind of review Matt Sullivan had given it in 2022. The picture assembled itself piece by piece, and every piece locked into the same frame. The board vote wasn't about Kyle. The restructuring wasn't about modernization. It was about removing the only person who had ever looked at a Lakemont invoice and said no, formally, in writing, with 4 pages of evidence behind it. The chairman had waited 2 years, engineered a vote to remove Matt, and installed the one person he could count on to approve whatever was placed in front of him without reading it. And that was exactly what Kyle had done, rubber stamping invoices that funneled revenue to a company his uncle's wife owned. Laura brought the evidence to the company's outside legal counsel, a firm in downtown Pittsburgh that had represented Pemberton for 15 years. The lead attorney reviewed the shell company filings, the invoice trail, the pricing discrepancies. He told Laura the pattern was strong, but they needed the foundational document, Matt's 2022 memo, and the chairman's written response. Without the original, the case was circumstantial. With it, it was damning. Laura drove to Matt's house that same evening. She told him what the attorney said. Matt listened, nodded once, and told her to follow him. He led her through the kitchen and out the back door. The detached garage sat at the end of a short concrete path, its single bulb already on. The space hadn't held a car in years. Both walls were lined with metal shelving units, and on those shelves sat rows of white banker's boxes, each one labeled in Matt's square handwriting with a year and a department code. 11 years of internal communications. Every memo, every report, every email thread he'd considered important enough to print and file. Organized by year, subdivided by category, stacked 3 deep, Laura stopped just inside the door. She looked at the shelves, then at Matt. He was already pulling a box from the second row. They found the 2022 box on the second shelf from the top. Matt set it on the concrete floor, knelt beside it, and flipped through the folders until he found the one marked Vendor Review Declined. Inside was the memo. 4 pages, single-spaced. Matt had flagged Lakemont Distribution by name, broken down the pricing structure line by line, identified the surcharge layers and volume penalties that would have cost the company more than the existing supplier arrangement, and recommended the company decline. Stapled to the back of the memo was the chairman's email response, 1 sentence, declined. Not cost-effective. 2 years later, the chairman fired the man who wrote that memo, installed his own nephew, and approved the same deal with no review at all. Matt and Laura sat on folding metal chairs in the middle of the garage, surrounded by file boxes on 3 sides. The fluorescent tube overhead buzzed faintly. The concrete floor was cold. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Will you testify?" Laura asked. Matt looked at her across the narrow space between their chairs. He held her gaze for a long moment. When? Week 4 broke the company apart. Line 3 went down during the Thursday night shift, a cascading failure that started in the sequencing controller and spread upstream through the calibration layer until the entire production line locked. The overnight crew attempted a manual restart 3 times. Nothing responded. By 2 in the morning, the machines on Line 3 hadn't moved in 6 hours. 4 hours after that, line 1 started throwing the same errors. Same pattern, same cascade. The grid's automated safeguards, the ones Matt had designed, to prevent exactly this kind of chain failure had been overridden weeks ago. There was nothing left to catch the fall. Anderson pulled their contract that morning. One phone call, 7 minutes, $4.2 million in annual revenue gone before 9 o'clock. By noon, 2 more clients followed, a valve manufacturer in Youngstown and a hydraulic systems company out of Wheeling. Combined, another $1.8 million walked out the door. The board convened an emergency session that afternoon. Laura stood at the front of the room with a projector and walked them through everything. The Lakemont invoices, the Ridgeline Holdings registration, the chairman's wife listed as the shell company's sole officer, Matt's 2022 memo, the one that had flagged Lakemont by name and been formally declined, and then the override logs, line by line, Kyle's login credentials, attached to every manual change that had dismantled the grid's automated safeguards over 4 weeks. Total invoice to Lakemont at 40% above market rate, $1.7 million in 28 days. The chairman joined by conference call for the second time that month. A misunderstanding in procurement, he said. His voice was steady, almost bored. Laura didn't respond to him. She looked at the 6 board members sitting around the table. The vote was 6-2. The chairman was suspended from his position pending a formal investigation. Kyle Pemberton's building access was revoked within the hour. Security met him at his desk, collected his badge, and walked him to the lobby. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't look back at the production floor on his way out. That night, the factory was dark. Laura drove back to the building alone, parked in the empty lot, and walked in through the side entrance. The production floor at 2 in the morning looked like a place that had been abandoned mid-sentence. Overhead lights on emergency mode, dim amber strips along the ceiling, casting long shadows across machinery that hadn't moved in over 10 hours. Tools left on workbenches, a clipboard hanging from a hook on line 2 with the last shift's production numbers still written in pencil. The silence was total. No hum, no rhythm, no vibration through the concrete. Just dead air and the faint smell of machine oil going cold. She pulled out her phone and called Matt's number. When he picked up, she didn't say her name. She read him the serial number off the sequencing controller on line 3. Silence on the other end, 3 seconds, 4. Then, which shift crew is still on site? She told him. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He arrived at 2:30, walked in through the main entrance, crossed the empty floor without stopping, and stood in front of the grid's central control terminal, the same workstation he'd sat at 1,000 times over 11 years. The monitor was showing error codes in amber text, scrolling faster than anyone but him could read. Laura stood a few steps behind him. He set his hands on the keyboard and began pulling diagnostic screens, one after another, his fingers moving without hesitation. Neither of them said a word. Matt worked through the night. No contract, no badge, no job title, no authority, except the kind that comes from being the only person alive who understands how something works from the inside out. He rolled back Kyle's overrides one at a time, restoring sequencing parameters, recalibrating dependency chains, rebuilding logic trees that had been cut and recut until nothing downstream could find its inputs anymore. Some corrections took 30 seconds, others took an hour of tracing a single broken pathway through 6 layers of code. He worked the way he always had, steady, unhurried, precise. Each fix was deliberate. Each one brought the system one step closer to the architecture he'd designed a decade ago. The building was empty, except for the 2 of them and the overnight security guard at the front desk. The factory floor stretched out dark and silent on every side, machines standing still like furniture in a house no one lives in. Laura stayed. She didn't leave the building once. At 4 in the morning, she walked to the break room, poured black coffee into a paper cup, and brought it back to the terminal. She set it on the edge of the console without a word. Matt picked it up, without looking at her, and kept typing. They didn't talk. There was nothing that needed saying. The work was the only conversation that mattered, and the work was happening under his hands, one command at a time. By 6, line 3 came back online. The sequencing controller accepted its first automated command in over 10 hours. By 6:30, line 1 stabilized, the cascade errors cleared, the calibration layer reconnected, and the machines began cycling again. The floor crew started filtering back to their stations as word spread through the building. Nobody called a meeting. Nobody made an announcement. They just saw Matt at the terminal and understood. The men and women who had worked under him for years fell back into the old rhythm without being told positions, timing, hand signals across the floor, like a crew that had rehearsed together for a decade, which is exactly what they were. Frank Kettner found Laura in the hallway outside the control room just after 7. He leaned against the cinder block wall and folded his arms. "He always showed up," Frank said quietly. "Every single time." Laura offered Matt the operations director position that morning. Full reinstatement, full authority, full control over staffing and vendor relationships. A clean start. Matt looked at her for a moment. His eyes were tired, but there was something behind them that hadn't been there a month ago. "I need to think about it," he said. He walked out to the parking lot at 7:15. His shoulders were stiff and his eyes burned from 14 hours in front of a screen, but his hands were steady. The sun was coming up over the Pittsburgh skyline, pale early light catching the bridges, the river, the steel-colored face of the building behind him. A pigeon landed on the chain-link fence near the loading dock and sat there, unbothered. And from inside the factory, through the open dock doors, a sound carried across the asphalt, faint at first, then steady, a low, continuous hum. The production lines were running. It was a sound that nobody in that building had heard in 4 weeks, and it changed the quality of the air outside, the way a heartbeat changes the silence of a room. That weekend, Matt was home with Cody. Saturday morning, no alarm, no schedule, no lunchbox to pack. Just a quiet house and the kind of slow hours that only come twice a week. The kitchen smelled like toast, and the coffee Matt had made an hour ago and hadn't finished. Cody sat at the table working through a sheet of long division problems, his pencil moving in small, careful strokes across the lined paper. He erased something, frowned, blew the shavings off the page, and tried the problem again from the top. Matt sat across from him with a cup of coffee and the newspaper spread open, though he hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. He wasn't reading. He was looking at something on the kitchen counter, a business card. Slightly warped, the ink faded along one edge where rain had soaked through the cardstock weeks ago. It had sat on the porch railing for nearly 3 weeks before Matt brought it inside. He didn't remember exactly when he'd picked it up. He just noticed it on the counter one morning, next to the dish soap, as though it had always been there. Cody pressed too hard, and his pencil tip snapped. He looked up, annoyed at the pencil more than anything, and caught Matt's eye across the table. Matt reached over to the junk drawer, pulled out a sharpener, and handed it across without a word. Cody sharpened the pencil, tested the point against his thumb, and went back to his problem set. The house was quiet. Saturday morning quiet, the kind where you can hear the neighbor's sprinkler through the open window and a dog barking 2 streets over. Matt watched Cody work for a moment, the way the kid held the pencil too tight, the way his eyebrows pulled together when the numbers didn't come out right on the first try. Small things, the kind of things you only notice when you're sitting still long enough to look. Matt glanced at the business card on the counter one more time. Then he picked up his phone. Laura answered on the second ring. He didn't say hello. "I have one condition," he said. Silence on the other end. She waited. "I pick my own team." She didn't hesitate. No negotiation. No caveat. Done. Matt set the phone on the table. Cody glanced up from his homework, looked at his father for a second, then went back to his division problem. Matt gave him a small nod across the table, quiet, easy, like a period at the end of a sentence. The pencil scratched against paper. That was enough. 3 months later, the production floor at Pemberton Industrial Solutions was running 3 shifts, 6 days a week. The grid had been fully restored and upgraded. Matt had added a redundancy layer to the sequencing controller so that no single override could cascade through the system the way Kyle's had. A manual lockout now required dual authorization from the operations director and the shift supervisor on duty before any automated parameter could be changed. Line 3, the one that had gone silent at 2 in the morning and started everything, was now the highest throughput station on the floor. The Anderson Group came back, not because anyone asked them to, because their procurement team evaluated 3 alternative suppliers over 6 weeks, found nothing within 200 miles that matched Pemberton's quality and turnaround, and called Laura's office to quietly reopen the conversation. The contract was reinstated at the original terms. 2 new clients followed within the same quarter, a defense subcontractor in the Philadelphia suburbs and an automotive parts manufacturer in Detroit. By the end of the 2nd month, revenue had recovered past pre-crisis levels. By the 3rd, it had exceeded them. The chairman never came back to the building. The board voted unanimously to remove him from his position in a session held the week after Matt's reinstatement. The federal investigation into Lakemont Distribution and Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, proceeded through the fall, handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Pennsylvania. Kyle Pemberton left Pittsburgh sometime in late September. Someone in accounting heard he'd gone to Florida. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked where exactly. Matt's office was the same one he'd had before, 2nd floor, overlooking the production floor through a long interior window. He kept the desk clean, the blinds open, and the door unlocked. The framed photo of Cody at a Little League game went back on the shelf next to the monitor. The reference manual he'd written himself went back in the top drawer. Most evenings, around 5:30, Laura would stop by on her way out. She'd lean against the doorframe and ask how things were running, and Matt would tell her not in slide decks or summary reports, just in plain sentences about what had gone right that day and what still needed work. Sometimes she'd sit down in the chair across from his desk. Sometimes the conversation drifted away from the company entirely, books Cody was reading, a restaurant she'd been meaning to try, whether the Pirates had any chance this year. She always stayed a little longer than she meant to. He started walking her to her car after those conversations. Not every night, but most. Through the front lobby, across the parking lot, past the loading dock, into whatever light the sky had left. They never talked about what it was. They never named it. 2 people who had come through something together and kept choosing to stand next to each other. The company picnic was the last Saturday in September. Someone from HR had organized it, a pavilion reservation at a park along the Allegheny River, east of the city. Folding tables covered in paper tablecloths, stacks of paper plates, a big steel grill that 3 guys from the warehouse crew argued over all afternoon. Kids from a dozen families ran in loose packs across the grass, weaving between the picnic tables and the tree line, their voices carrying across the field. Cody was out there somewhere in the middle of it, running with the pack, laughing at something another kid said, his shoes already grass-stained. Matt and Laura stood at the edge of the field, a few steps back from the rest of the crowd. The river moved behind them, wide and slow. She held out a cup of coffee. He took it. They stood there for a while, not talking, watching the light shift across the water and the kids cut back and forth across the grass. "You could have let it all fall apart," Laura said. Matt looked at her. "No, I couldn't." The sun dropped behind the hills on the far side of the river. From where they stood, you could still hear the factory, a faint, steady hum carried on the evening air. The afternoon shift had clocked in an hour ago. The lines were running. Both of them could hear it from here.